featuring our candidates for U.S. President and Vice President, Joseph Kishore and Santa Cruz. My name is Eric London. I'm the campaign manager of the party's 2020 election campaign, and I will be one of two moderators for tonight's event. We are meeting under extraordinary circumstances. The threat of dictatorship looms over the U.S. elections with immense implications for every country on earth. Donald Trump is not running an election campaign per se. He's preparing an attempt at a coup d'etat. He has initiated a plan to override the popular vote and to stay in power by mobilizing his supporters in the police, in the immigration authority, and on the extreme right. And such a plan, if it is successful, would mean the abrogation of the American Constitution and a massive assault on the rights of the working class in the US and internationally. The Democratic Party, more fearful of social opposition from below than of martial law and dictatorship, is directing itself to its main constituencies, Wall Street, the military, and the intelligence agencies, to explain that the 77-year-old former senator from the Shell Corporation capital of the world is a more able steward of the crown jewels of American imperialism than the Republican rival. To the masses of people who oppose fascism and dictatorship, Biden issues soporifics intended to lull the people to sleep, calling Trump's threats nothing more than a distraction. In the Washington Post and the New York Times editorial boards and on the corporate TV channels, complacent and affluent talking heads with no independent thoughts of their own fill column space and airtime with paeans to the so-called adults in the room, raising baseless claims about Russian interference as though Trump was merely an accidental interloper in the Garden of Eden that was American democracy. Meanwhile, over 1 million people have died worldwide as the coronavirus pandemic continues on its deadly path of destruction, including claiming the lives of more than 200,000 people in the United States. Borrowing from Dickens's famous novel, The Coronavirus has shown that today under capitalism, it truly is both the best of times and the worst of times. With hundreds of millions of people unemployed, hundreds of millions more facing food insecurity, their studies cut off, going without needed health care, the stock markets climb almost every week to new heights. And as millions of workers are forced back to work under unsafe conditions, worried that every day this could be the day that they get sick and infect their families because they need a paycheck, at the same time, the wealthy retreat to their second or third homes in the countryside and happily refresh the browsers on their stock portfolios, healthy as ever in part thanks to the bipartisan mega bailout known as the CARES Act. To these people, Biden explains that if he's elected, as he put it, nothing would fundamentally change, while figures like Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez falsely portray the Democratic Party as capable of reform. Contained in this situation are immense dangers, but also revolutionary potential. The global working class is larger, it's more interconnected than ever before, with unprecedented access to information and technology. The past 2 years have witnessed the largest mass mobilization in history, including in the United States and in dozens and dozens of other countries throughout the world. And the outcome of the present crisis will be determined, as Leon Trotsky wrote in the founding document of the Fourth International, by the development of revolutionary leadership. This is what we propose to address at tonight's meeting. We are grateful to be joined by Oscar Grenfell, who will also be moderating this event. Oscar is a member of the National Committee of the Socialist Equality Party Australia and a writer for the World Socialist website. And also, we're very glad to be introduced by our exceptional candidates this year. Joseph Kishore is the Socialist Equality Party's presidential candidate. He's the party's national secretary. It's a position that he has held since 2008. Joe joined the Socialist Equality Party in 1999, after becoming radicalized by the US war against Serbia. And over the past 2 decades, as readers of the World Socialist website doubtless know, he has written hundreds of articles for the World Socialist website and has directed the party's intervention in the struggles of workers and youth. Nerissa Santa Cruz is the party's vice presidential candidate. She joined the party in 2013. She was initially introduced to the Socialist Equality Party through the International Youth and Students for Social Equality, following its intervention in protests in California to defend public education. She has written extensively on the issues faced by healthcare workers and educators, as well as the bipartisan attack on the rights of immigrants and refugees. Before we begin, I just want to notify all those who are listening. First of all, we thank you for attending. Second of all, there are a lot of questions which are coming in from our audience all over the world on several continents already. We're just beginning to get them. But if you have a question that comes up at any point during this discussion, you can send them to our Slido account, and that is sli.do/socialism2020. So we hope that is, again, sli.do/socialism2020, or if you're watching on social media, we have people who are monitoring the threads and you can leave questions there. So I will stop talking, but first I want to ask an initial question to open this meeting. For both of the candidates, setting aside the polls, which obviously fluctuate, why is this meeting titled The Civil War Election? On September 9th, the political committee of the Socialist Equality Party in the US published a statement with that same title. And that statement says, quote, "The strategy of the working class cannot be guided by the arithmetic of an election, but the logic of the class struggle." Could you elaborate on this?
Hi, yes, and thank you, Eric, for the introduction. And I want to also welcome all of those who are listening or watching this event in the United States and throughout the world. We speak about the Civil War election. I would say, first of all, that it is clear that this is an election which is really unprecedented in American history. The next several weeks, we'll see the unfolding of a political and constitutional crisis of enormous scope. And by referring to the Civil War election, we're seeking to draw attention to the fact that underlying the political crisis in America is an incredible growth of social tensions and class struggle with revolutionary implications. I think, first of all, it's really critical to understand what the Trump administration is doing and the seriousness of the threat. Trump is not so much running an election campaign. He's seeking to transform the election into a coup d'etat. This is the essential significance behind his repeated threats not to recognize the election results, not to transfer power peacefully, calling the election a scam, his efforts to stack the Supreme Court by ramming through his nomination because he understands that the Supreme Court could be a central focus of the efforts to rubber stamp his attempts to steal the election. This is part of a broader strategy. I mean, going back to, I would say also the incitement of far-right organizations to intimidate people at the polls and carry out violence at the polls. And this is part of a broader political strategy. I mean, it certainly goes back to the speech that he gave on June 1st at the Rose Garden, where he threatened to invoke the Insurrection Act to mobilize the military against protests over police violence. The deployment of federal police in Portland and other cities, the praise for right-wing individuals who carried out murder against protesters, Kyle Rittenhouse in particular. He's pursuing a very deliberate strategy. And I think that there is, I mean, first of all, there's a staggering contrast between the aggressiveness of the Trump administration, the feckless and unserious and cowardly response of the Democratic Party, which is seeking to do everything it can to prevent the development of a movement of workers and young people that would challenge the interests of the financial oligarchy and the interests of American imperialism. I mean, the response of the Democratic Party has been to downplay the significance of what Trump is doing. Biden gave an interview a couple days ago in which he referred to the moves by Trump as a distraction in relationship to the Supreme Court pick. They've already declared that there's nothing that they will do to stop the appointment of Trump's choice. Going a long way to not just, as we say in one of our recent statements, not just conceding an individual on the Supreme Court, but going a long way to conceding the election itself, given the fact that the Supreme Court could play a central role in determining the outcome. But I think, you know, so that's the response of the Democratic Party. But as I said, underlying and what Trump is really responding to is the incredible growth of social tensions. After all, Trump did not, as you said, he did not arise out of nowhere. He's not an interloper in the Garden of Eden of American democracy. He did not arise out of the depths of hell. He's a product of massive levels of social inequality, of endless war, of the criminality of ruling class policy internationally and within the United States, and processes that have been vastly accelerated by the coronavirus pandemic and the response of the ruling elite to it. You have now over 209,000 people who have died just in the United States, 209,000 as a result of the criminal incompetence, and not just incompetence, the deliberate policy of the ruling class in response to the pandemic. They did nothing to prepare the population. They used the pandemic to hand trillions of dollars over to Wall Street. And then they've implemented this back to work and back to school campaign, which is having catastrophic consequences. At the same time, you have tens of millions of people unemployed. People are being cut off of unemployment benefits, people being thrown out of their homes. So this is the social situation. And there's a deep growth of, or profound growth of social and political opposition in the working class and among youth, including the ongoing demonstrations over police violence. And that is what the Trump administration is responding to, and what underlies this profound crisis of bourgeois democracy. When we say that, you know, the strategy of workers has to be based not on the arithmetic of the election, but the logic of the class struggle, is because the issues facing workers in the United States and around the world are not going to be, in this election, not going to be solved on an electoral basis. They have to be solved through the development of the class struggle, through the independent intervention of the working class against the Trump administration. There has to be a fight against the administration and its conspiracies, but it can't be done through the Democratic Party. The working class has to intervene with its own program, with a socialist program, and through the methods of the class struggle. And that's the orientation which we have in this election campaign, not oriented towards one or another faction of this right-wing political establishment, but towards the development of the class struggle and the building of a leadership in the working class.
Thank you, Joe. Nerissa, do you want to add anything to this?
Yeah, I mean, I think Joe pointed to many of the main themes that we're going to outline in today's meeting. But, you know, again, with the question of the reference to the Civil War, I mean, the Trump and the Republicans essentially are refusing, making very clear that they are not going to accept by any means a Biden presidency. And when you sort of draw that out to what that means, it means the will of the people, the vote count, all of that sort of just be damned. The Trump administration is going to pursue through unconstitutional means Trump's victory. So, you know, we don't know what's going to happen come election day, but part of the, this analogy to the Civil War is that, you know, there really hasn't been another election as contested as there has been since the presidency of Abraham Lincoln. So, but the difference is that the two, irreconcilable class forces in society today, compared to the Civil War between, the North, industrial North versus the slaveocracy in the South. Today, those two irreconcilable class forces are the ruling elite, which within the Biden, which both Biden or Trump represent. There is one of the big myths is that that's promoted by the Democratic Party is that come November, should Biden win, this would be the great solution to the COVID pandemic, the great solution to mass unemployment, desperation. I mean, as was stated, we're facing a situation in which, there are 50 million people in America alone who are on the verge of hunger. The fact that, this is unfolding and there are reopening campaigns, workers are being pushed back to work across blue states, red states, Democratic, Republican governors, you name it. These are the policies that are being pursued by both big business parties. So, there's, on the one hand, there's the dictates of a ruling elite, of a financial oligarchy, and on the other, the irreconcilable class on the other side is that of the working class. And it's an international working class they're fighting to prevent, mass deaths, and essentially, everything that is involved, we can get into this more, but everything that is bound up with the pandemic is fundamentally bound up with the capitalist system. So this is an election that is, highly contested. What's at stake is essentially all democratic norms and constitutional rights. And there are international implications for, this a coup by the Trump administration.
Hi, Oscar Grenfell from the SEP in Australia here. Look, as someone who's outside of the United States, I can say that this election is being followed very closely by workers, young people here, and I'm sure that's replicated in countries around the world. I think people have watched on over the past months, the scenes of militarized police, federal agents attacking protesters, now Trump's declarations that he won't respect the outcome of the election. And there's a real degree of shock, a sort of sense of how could this happen in the United States. And it does remind me of a point that we've made a number of times on the World Socialist website. We've said that throughout much of the 20th century, the US was able to act as the global guarantor of capitalist stability. If there was a crisis in any part of the world, the US would mobilize its military, its diplomatic power, but also its economic resources to get the situation under control in the interests of the banks, big business. And American elections were held up as a model to be emulated around the world. Clearly, that's no longer the case. I mean, you have an enormous global crisis, which is now centered in the US. And American imperialism is the most destabilizing factor in the world situation. So I'm wondering if you could speak about what this election crisis means globally in terms of popular sentiment, the development of the class struggle, but also in terms of imperialist geopolitics. So I'll hand that over to either of you.
Well, I can make some initial comments. We published an important lecture by David North, which was actually delivered in Australia in 2000, dealing with the 2000 election crisis, now 20 years ago. and it reviewed the sort of progress. It was actually delivered during the Supreme Court arguments, which would ultimately end in the decision to hand the election to George W. Bush. And there are many points in that which we may go back to the significance of the 2000 elections. But one of the points that he made, I just want to cite this because it gets to this question. He was discussing the global significance of a massive political crisis in the United States, which is what the 2000 elections were. And he made the following point. He said, ultimately, no matter what problems capitalism gets itself in any part of the world, there has always been Uncle Sam to bail it out. The Federal Reserve has only to open up the spigots and the money will flow. Mexico can go bankrupt and money will be sent there. Asia can go under, but something will be done to fix it up. But what happens if Uncle Sam has a stroke? Who will bail him out? Who will save him? That is a question no one has had to ask or trouble themselves with in the 20th century. Now, as we enter the 21st century, this is a serious issue. And I think you have that now with certainly on an even higher scale with the crisis which is now taking place in the United States. First of all, the rise of Trump in the first place, and now this ever more open and direct turn towards dictatorial forms of rule. I mean, the old adage, "It can't happen here," referring to the growth of fascism in the United States. Well, it not only can, it is. And the ruling class is cultivating very deliberately far-right fascistic forces and breaking with constitutional forms of rule. And that does have global consequences. I mean, throughout the 20th century, particularly in the aftermath of the Second World War, the United States was sort of the backstop of world capitalism. But that has, Trump is himself, or the crisis is an expression of a much more protracted a decline in the global position of American capitalism, to which it has responded through the endless use of military force and imperialist violence all over the world, a decline in the relative economic position, decline in the position of American corporations and American capitalism. That's been connected to the growth of debt, financialization, and an ever-growing and endless assault on the living conditions of the working class, and so therefore the growth of class antagonisms. But under these pressures now, you have the breakdown of the stability of the political institutions of the United States, and that has global consequences. I think certainly ruling elites throughout the world are looking at what is happening in the United States with grave concern. They're also, plotting their own measures. I mean, you have the growth of the far right is an international phenomenon. You have the rise of the AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland in Germany, the rise of Bolsonaro in Brazil, of Modi in India, the far right throughout Europe and Eastern Europe, and the breakup of democratic forms. And it is a global process, and similar global tendencies in relationship to the coronavirus pandemic. The herd immunity policy, which the United States is clearly implementing, is a global policy. But to answer your question, I think that this crisis will have international consequences. I would say, because above all, in the emergence of the working class, which is so critical, the emergence, the interference of the working class into this crisis through the development of class struggle, will have global ramifications. And it will itself become I think, a pole of attraction for workers and young people fighting all over the world against the same conditions.
Well, if I could just, I think that's an important point. I mean, one issue also of the response of the Democratic Party is that it's not the case, and maybe we can return to this theme later, but it's not the case that the greater the opposition from below, the more susceptible to reform this party is, the Democratic Party. It's the opposite. It's the more opposition there is, the more hostile the Democratic Party is to any response from below. But there's a quote from Trotsky which describes the situation between the First and Second World Wars. And then I'd like to use this to transition to a question for Nerissa, which has come in from the audience. But Trotsky writes that, and Joe is just speaking on this, but when one follows the situation in America, Trotsky wrote, by analogy with electrical engineering, democracy might be defined as a system of safety switches and circuit breakers for protection against currents overloaded by the national or social struggle. No period of human history has been even remotely so overcharged with antagonisms such as ours. Under the impact of class and international contradictions that are too highly charged, the safety switches of democracy either burn out, or explode. That is what the short circuit of dictatorship represents. Now you have a situation where the military is making statements, and we remember it was only in June that the Trump administration threatened to call the military into major cities. We know what happened in Portland with the kidnapping of activists by the federal police, and the possibility that Trump will call in the military again under the Insurrection Act is very, very real. The one reader from New Jersey, Howard, asks, what role do you see the U.S. military's involvement in potentially arbitrating a disputed election and or the social chaos that would ensue? Nerissa?
Sure. I mean, there have been recent statements from officials within the Biden campaign saying that they are in touch with, military and state intelligence officials to sort of, ensure through possible military means that that Trump would exit the White House. And the World Socialist website, our party has really, laid out that this, if this were to happen, this would essentially, mean that Biden would be a puppet of the Pentagon and would be, essentially a threat of military dictatorship by other means. So, there is no solution that is in any way in line with democratic rights or norms that involves in any way the intervention of the military.
If I could also just add to that, there's articles which are appearing in the bourgeois press now about the discussions within the military over what to do in an election crisis. McMaster was on the talk shows, Trump's former advisor, national security advisor, talking about the role of the military in the elections. There's a lot of discussions in the background over the response of the military under conditions of an election crisis. The whole orientation of the Democratic Party. I mean, what is the Democratic Party? The Democratic Party is a party of Wall Street, the military and intelligence agencies, and privileged sections of the upper middle class, particularly those mobilized on the basis of identity politics, which we could perhaps talk about more later. But that is the Democratic Party. And throughout all of the past now nearly 4 years of the Trump administration, the entire aim of the Democratic Party has been to suppress popular opposition to Trump, which erupted immediately after the election, and direct it behind the sections of the military and intelligence agencies that were concerned with Trump, particularly from the standpoint of foreign policy, and the demand that he take a more aggressive policy, particularly in relationship to Russia, as well as in the Middle East. And that was the essential conflict. We wrote about this in an early statement by the Socialist Equality Party, Palace Coup or Class Struggle, where we spoke about what is the character of the divisions within the ruling class. And that has proceeded now throughout the course of the administration. The Democrats have sought to channel opposition, enormous popular opposition to Trump, behind this reactionary militarist faction of the ruling class and their conflict with Trump. And that has produced only disaster. And certainly the orientation in relationship to the election, their hope is that if there is a crisis, that the military will intervene in some way. That's their last resort. Will escort him out. Biden said basically the same thing in his interview with MSNBC the other day. He said, "Well, you know, if something happens, you know, there's a lot of people in the military and in the Department of Homeland Security and the FBI who are not going to accept this." And so that's what the Democratic Party represents, and that's why it is so. That explains its response to this crisis, because it speaks for class interests, and that's why it's so terrified of the growth of popular opposition to the Trump administration, why it's continuously seeking to cover up what is happening. Throughout the whole administration, it has done this, and then collaborating with Trump on key elements of domestic policy, because that's what this party is. It's the class interests that are expressed by this organization. So that's, I think, really critical for workers and young people to understand, because it's, you know, the development of a real fight against the enormous dangers represented by Trump, whether he's in the White House or out of it, has to be developed on the basis of an independent class policy, which is what we are fighting for.
If I could just ask a follow-up question on that. I think, as you've outlined, I mean, Biden and the Democratic Party establishment are appealing to the military, the intelligence agencies. Clearly, there's no defense of democracy from that quarter, but it seems that the shift to the right extends more broadly. Obviously, a significant feature of this election was the support won for Bernie Sanders, again, as in 2016. He claimed that he was waging a political revolution against the billionaire class within the Democratic Party, and he was promoted by all manner of pseudo-left organizations, some of whom claim to be socialist. But as I understand it, Sanders is now among Biden's most enthusiastic supporters. His political revolution is wound up in support for the Democratic Party establishment. Could you speak about that broader political lineup that's on display here?
Yeah, I can take that on. I mean, what, you know, Sanders essentially, dropped out of the race precisely as the COVID pandemic was exploding throughout the United States and throughout the world back in March. This was at the very time at which, many, millions throughout the world were sort of seeing the death and the destruction of the capitalist system, and the question of socialism was really put before workers throughout the world very clearly. And it was at this time that Sanders pulled out of the race and threw his weight and support behind Biden, and as you said, Oscar, has been one of his biggest cheerleaders. Significantly, the response to this attempted, this threat of a coup by Sanders and many others within the Democratic Party have been to call for massive voter turnout so that there is a landslide victory. Sanders said that there needed to be a landslide victory so that Trump would be less likely to dispute the vote, and that he said this was the best means of ensuring democracy. And when you sort of break down what he's saying, I mean, one, the Constitution does not say that in order for a presidential candidate to win the presidency, they have to have a landslide victory. No, all you have to have is the majority of electoral votes, 270 or more. This is in the Constitution. So, you don't need to have a landslide victory already by stating, so by calling on, mass voter turnout is immediately sort of conceding to these anti-democratic, unconstitutional threats by Trump. And, as was stated, the Democrats, just like the Republicans, what they are, they're most fearful of, the working class rising to its feet, of calling out any opposition to this attack on the Constitution and democratic rights out of fear that they would be swept up and swept aside in the process. So, the very fact that this is being called for by Sanders and the Democratic Party also shows the degree to which, there is no constituency for democratic rights within either party. And I also want to make the point too. One of the organs that have of the DSA, the Jacobin magazine, which has turned as well to the promotion of Biden, which is, as the World Socialist website and the Socialist Equality Party has analyzed from day one, the role of Sanders in this election, just as it was in 2016, was to sow illusions in the Democratic Party, to capture all left-wing sentiment and throw it right back fundamentally into the capitalist system. Jacobin magazine, in its recent publications in the last few days, has been really stating that the main problem of the Democrats in sort of not fighting the rush to appoint a new member to the Supreme Court is a result of their politeness. They actually say that the Democrats are too focused on likability and bipartisanship, and that this is why they don't fight. So they're fundamentally, they have no class analysis at all. They cover up for the hostile class policies of the Democrats, which represent the ruling class, and fundamentally, again, sow illusions in the Democratic Party, and have really done everything to cover up the unconstitutional nature of this coup attempt.
Well, the Democratic Party is very polite to Trump, but when it comes to prosecuting immigrants and the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and drone assassination and mass surveillance, of course, they're not quite as polite on those questions. But before I get to another question for Joe, I do want to notify those who are just joining us that this is a meeting held by the Socialist Equality Party of the U.S. and the International Committee of the Fourth International. It is featuring Joe Kishore and Nerissa Santa Cruz, the Socialist Equality Party's candidates for President and Vice President of the United States. If you are just joining us, we are glad to have you. Please follow our candidates on Twitter and share as widely as possible as you can. We still have plenty of time in this meeting, so please spread the word so that others can join us. I do want to say to those who are here, to those who have been following Joe and Nerissa's campaign, that if you should take anything from the events which are taking place and the analysis that the World Socialist website and the Socialist Equality Party have been putting forward over the course of the last several months, in the course of this election campaign, we hope it's that you decide to get involved, get off the sidelines, join the Socialist Equality Party. We are not just a party which is commenting on events. We are a party which is fighting to develop a leadership in the working class, which is required to prevent the worst crimes of the 20th century from repeating themselves today. We ask that you go to socialism2020.org/join. And I guess I would say, and this is not meant flippantly, but if you are on the sidelines of socialist politics and the events of the last 2 to 3 weeks are not incentive for you to make the decision to join and dedicate yourself to revolution, then perhaps you should think a bit harder about it. But we do ask that you those who are interested, please join Please submit forms to join the Socialist Equality Party. This is a question for Joseph. We've been writing on the World Socialist website about the anti-democratic climate in which this election campaign has taken place. The Socialist Equality Party tried to get ballot access in a number of states. Of course, it was impossible to gather signatures because of the pandemic. I wonder, could you speak on what you think the significance of these attempts were and what the outcome of these attempts were for those who may not know?
Yes, if I could just make one point on Sanders, because I do think that is a very critical political experience, not just in the United States, but internationally. I think it's a question not only of drawing the lessons of Sanders himself, whose political revolution has sort of turned into an all-out campaign for the corrupt corporatist senator from Delaware and longtime scion of the Democratic Party establishment, Joe Biden, but a whole type of politics, which sort of seeks to promote the fiction that there are solutions to the great problems confronting mankind, whether it's the pandemic, social inequality, world war, global warming, without the development of an independent movement of the working class and the development of the class struggle. And this is an international phenomenon. You have the experiences of Syriza in Greece, which came to power in 2015 and proceeded to claiming that it was going to oppose austerity and proceeded to implement massive austerity measures. You have the experience of Podemos in Spain, which is now part of a government that is, and this is held up as one of the great left parties, supposedly, Podemos in Spain, which is part of a government which is implementing the same homicidal back to work and back to school policies that are being implemented here in the United States by Trump. We have the experience of AMLO in Mexico. I mean, a whole sort of type of politics, which is really, it's bourgeois politics, and it seeks to divert social opposition. And the support for Sanders certainly expressed broad-based support, particularly among young people, for a left-wing alternative to capitalism. Support, it's an expression of growing interest in socialism. But young workers and young people have to draw the experiences and draw the conclusions from these experiences, the lessons which come out of them, not just in relationship to Sanders, but what type of political movement has to be built. In relationship to the ballot access issue, we launched our campaign at the beginning of the year in January. And then Nerissa and I, we had a series of public meetings in California in February. And this was just as the pandemic was really beginning to develop in the United States. At the time, the ruling class was downplaying the danger of the pandemic, and it was preparing its massive bailout. We ended that meeting, and I think I got back to Detroit, and it became very clear this was a serious crisis. And this was going to develop into a massive public health crisis, not only in the United States, but all over the world. We made the decision then that we were not going to have public meetings. It would be irresponsible to do so. It would not endanger the health of our own supporters, as well as the public at large. And we made the decision that we could not possibly go out and petition to gather the thousands, tens of thousands of signatures that are required to get on the ballot under conditions of a pandemic. It would, you could hardly imagine a more ideal scenario for transmitting this deadly virus than going around and speaking to thousands and thousands of people to meet the anti-democratic ballot access requirements, which the American ruling class puts in place to prevent a left-wing opposition from being on the ballot. And so we then, the states in Michigan, California, and elsewhere said, well, no, it doesn't, the pandemic be damned, you still have to go out and gather signatures. Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of signatures in California. So we launched lawsuits, and we said, this is impossible. How can we be required to gather signatures in a pandemic when there are orders from the governor that say you have to stay at home, that you can't have gatherings, that you have to be 6 feet from people? What are we supposed to do? Dangle a petition out and hope someone picks it up and signs it. the undemocratic requirements to get on the ballot now are simply impossible or would be deadly. So we took these requirements to court. We said this is unconstitutional. It's a violation of our rights and the rights of workers and young people to be able to vote for someone besides the Democrats and Republicans, to require that we gather signatures to get on the ballot. The courts, by Republican and Democratic appointed judges, ruled in the favor of the states and said, it doesn't matter, you have to gather these signatures, and so you're not on the ballot. So that was, and ultimately it was the Supreme Court refused to hear our case challenging the decision in Michigan. And so we have been kept off the ballot in California and Michigan. The only place where the Socialist Equality Party will be on the ballot is Colorado, which is the only state which doesn't actually have physical signature requirements. But I think what it really sort of expresses, is the whole character of this political system. It's in the particular form of the pandemic and the denial of our right to get on the ballot amidst the pandemic, you sort of find expressed the sclerotic character of so-called democracy in the United States, which is dominated by two parties controlled by the financial oligarchy. So in relationship to the election, we get this question a lot. We certainly want people to vote for us. In Colorado, we will be on the ballot. In other states, we will have write-in status, so you can still write in our names and vote for us in the elections, and we want all of our supporters to do that. But our real orientation in this election is towards the development of a socialist movement in the working class, and we are oriented towards the development of that movement. So we want people to, as Eric was saying, the main conclusion we want people to draw from this experience is to join the Socialist Equality Party, help build this party in the working class. This is going to be a period of massive social unrest, protests, political crisis, and a socialist leadership has to be built. And that's what the orientation of workers and young people really has to be.
I think both of you, Joe and Narissa, have raised that the attacks on democratic rights by the Republicans and the Democrats alike are motivated by fears of social opposition from below, the immense growth of inequality in the United States. Certainly the protests against police violence over the past 5 months have been followed internationally, but there's much less in the world media about what's taking place in the factories, in the schools. Could you give us some sense of what the sentiment is among workers, including those who are being forced back on the job amid a rampaging pandemic? And I just wanted to also direct your attention to a question from a reader. They raise, is there collusion between the teachers' unions in the United States and both political parties in the reckless reopening of K-12 schools? Please discuss. So I'll direct those questions to both of you.
Yeah, I can start. Yeah, there's immense opposition to these deadly reopening policies. When we look at the schools, for instance, throughout dozens and dozens of districts, teachers are beginning to organize, particularly in this last week. There have been multiple sick outs from South Carolina to Michigan to Florida, to New York. Teachers and students are fighting essentially for their lives. They realize that they're being sent back for the pursuit of profits, so that their parents can be sent back to work, and so that the profits that they make for the ruling class continue to flow, so that as well as the trillions that were handed over to the financial oligarchy by means of the CARES Act are paid for. CARES Act. So, I mean, there's widespread anger and opposition, and we're seeing that definitely coalesce with these protests against police violence. The teachers, there have been the deaths of dozens of teachers since the schools have reopened. In some cases, we actually just heard from a teacher yesterday who participated in one of our meetings, who's a coworker who died. This is a teacher in Arizona. Her coworker passed, as well as her coworker's brother-in-law. So, it's devastating entire families. And there are, millions of workers who are basically being given this completely, just barbaric choice of having to go back to work, or being able to going back to work, or the choice to pay their bills and put food on the table. So it's that, or it's gambling with their lives. And in this, they're seeing that there's this is a policy that's being carried out, as we said, throughout all of the United States, as well as internationally. And something that's significant too is that it's the same policy of herd immunity, whether it's being forced back into the schools all at once with school reopenings, or versus the hybrid models that are peddled by the Democratic Party, and particularly Democratic-run states like this one in California, where you're exposed to the virus 3 out of 5 days a week, as if that made any difference to exposure and to rates of illness and the threat of this virus. So these are extreme conditions that workers are facing. Many, and what we're seeing too is that in every measure, COVID is really a class-based virus that is affecting the poor predominantly. Not only are poor workers being sent back to work, but that means too, in turn, that their children are having to go into the schools. So now a family has multiple exposures themselves as workers in their workplaces and factories, as well as their children in the schools. So there's immense anger and opposition, and the myth that's peddled by the Democratic Party is that with a Biden presidency, and all of this is going to change. And what we're really trying to emphasize is that it's absolutely not. And you need only look at those democratically run states and how things are going within those to see that the same policy of herd immunity is being pursued, either in full reopening or so-called hybrid models. It's the same policy.
If I agree very much with what Nerissa was saying, and I mean, the pandemic has accelerated many things. It's accelerated, this sort of political crisis. It's accelerated the growth of social antagonisms. I think it also sort of accelerating the exposure of different organizations and political tendencies. I mean, the AFL-CIO, the teachers' unions, first of all, in relationship to the specific question, are absolutely doing everything they can to prevent the growth of opposition or a coordinated struggle by teachers and educators and other sections of the working class against this homicidal policy. And the fact that you do not have any suggestion that there should be a strike against this, against the policies that are being implemented, is just such a damning exposure of these organizations. The fact of the matter is they're not workers' organizations. And by the AFT also, there was a struggle which erupted among graduate instructors at the University of Michigan. And the AFT did everything it could to isolate it. There's mass opposition in Detroit over the catastrophic conditions in the public schools and the partial reopening and the catastrophe of online learning. The teachers are, angry, are looking for a way to fight, and the AFT just completely isolated the struggle at the University of Michigan. But it's an expression of the nature of these organizations. I mean, the fact is that there was a mass opposition, or there was immense opposition in March. There was a series of walkouts among auto workers as the pandemic was first really developing, and the ruling class had not done anything to stop it. And auto workers engaged in wildcat strikes and walkouts to oppose the policy that was being pursued. The fact that they were forced to continue work. It wasn't with the UAW, it was direct opposition to the UAW. So these organizations, these are not workers' organizations. They are, Weingarten, the head of the AFT, is a top-level Democratic Party operative. These organizations are instruments of the corporations and of the state, particularly the Democratic Party. They support this policy. I'd also add, in relationship to Jacobin, which Nerissa was referring to before, they published an article recently, an interview, in which they supported the Back to School campaign. And they said that basically they supported the herd immunity policy promoted by Trump's right-wing advisor, Scott Atlas, of, basically let her rip and let the virus go. And so, I mean, that also reflects the interests of the trade union apparatus that Jacobin is representing. So you don't have, and I think this is one of the challenges that workers confront, is that, the so-called organizations, that supposedly represent them, the trade unions, in fact, are not. They are instruments of the corporate management of the state. They do not organize opposition. So workers face the necessity of the development of independent organizations of working class struggle, rank and file factory committees, neighborhood committees, that will organize opposition, that will connect the struggles of workers with the fight against police violence. These ongoing protests against police violence cannot be isolated from the development of opposition in the working class. They cannot be segregated from that. There has to be a development of a united movement of workers, but that requires the formation of new organizations of struggle. Our party in the U.S. and our sister parties in the International Committee have taken the lead in the fight for the formation of rank and file committees and these organizations, and that has begun. There's been a critical development among teachers in particular. We just had a meeting over the weekend, again, teachers from all across the country internationally participating in the development of new forms of working class struggle. But that's really a critical imperative. The trade unions do not function as workers' organizations. They aren't.
Well, I think this touches on a number of critical questions, and the issue as well that what the pandemic and what the American election crisis reveal is the burning and the environmental catastrophe as witnessed by the fires in the West Coast and in Australia at the beginning of this year, is the burning need, the existential need for the establishment of an entirely new type of society based on meeting human need and not private profit. That is socialism. And this is an important point. The issue of the 2000 election came up earlier, and there may be some, maybe in the candidates' responses, they may want to describe what happened a bit more, because there are a lot of listeners joining from their college campuses and high school students who may have been just coming into this life at the time of the December 2000 decision. But David North makes a point on the question of the development of consciousness and what a crisis like this or like that of 2000, and maybe Nerissa, you could speak on what's changed in the course of the last 20 years. But Comrade David made the point, and he says that these events, referring to the crisis of 2000, not only have vast economic consequences, they will change the social psychology that plays an important role in the evolution of a revolutionary situation. In the end, the conscious factor assumes massive dimensions in the development of a revolution. And then he says the following, which is very interesting, is the way that this is described. There's an objective revolutionary situation, but he also says, but people have to begin thinking about revolution. They have to want revolution and believe that revolution is a viable option. They have to feel not only the need, but also the possibility of fundamental social change. In the final analysis, it's not the power of the capitalist state alone that blocks revolution. At a more profound and historically essential level, it is the lack of political confidence and consciousness within the broad masses of their ability to intervene and reconstruct society from top to bottom. But the present crisis will provide an impulse for significant and progressive shifts in social consciousness. Nerissa, do you think that this is a bit of a toss-up question for you, but do you think that prognosis has been borne out? Maybe you could talk a bit more about this.
Yeah, I mean, I think even just immediately in the last, in the months since the pandemic, there has been a, shift in consciousness as far as, workers and students really understanding that they are expendable under the capitalist system. So, maybe the sentiment might have been before that, well, the bosses don't care or something like that. But it's, they're coming to understand that not only do the bosses and the corporations not care, they don't mind gambling with hundreds of thousands of lives. That is just the cost of doing business. And it isn't just with the lives of workers, it's with the lives of children and teachers and entire families. This has an effect on consciousness, as well as, the brutal assault that's happening, with the deployment of the National Guard to peaceful protests that have pretty much been continuing since May. I mean, the sentiment towards the state and its bodies of armed men is extremely hostile, and these and now with the on the verge of a potential presidential coup in the with the votes and the vote counting. I mean, already as you'd mentioned, the experience of the 2000 election hasn't been forgotten, that was a stolen election. Then you have the election of 2016 in which Trump lost the popular vote, and now potentially using the Supreme Court in a means to potentially hand over the presidency, the vote of the people. It's hard to say what's going to happen, but irregardless of the vote of the people. So I definitely agree with that statement, and that consciousness is beginning to move. And just part of the other part of your question with regard to the 2000 election, I think it would be important if we could just discuss even briefly what happened there. And you're correct. Many of us don't weren't politically conscious at the time, but we've been able to study it thanks to the analysis of the World Socialist website, and it was the election was November 7th of 2000. It really was one of the most extraordinary events in American political history. It initially, the kind of pollsters and media pundits had projected that Bush would have a marginal, but still a substantial lead over Gore. who was the vice president at the time. And, you know, come election day, they had not, you know, they had essentially underestimated that the votes. The Bush had taken states in the South and the Southwest. Gore had taken the industrial states. It was looking like he was most likely going to take the West Coast, and it was apparent that it was all going to come down to the electoral college votes in Florida. And you know, actually, polls were projecting a Gore victory in Florida. So, you know, the media outlets started to state so, and in an unprecedented fashion, Bush was, you know, got on television. His brother Jeb was the governor of Florida, and, you know, basically had, you know, begun to carry out, which would be, you know, many maneuvers to halt vote counting. It would lead to the suppression of tens of thousands of votes. The Florida court would step in to say that the votes had to be counted, and Bush and the Supreme Court, you know, Bush would go to the Supreme Court to actually come out with a 5-4 ruling, essentially stating that the population has no right to suffrage, that it wasn't the will of the people that decided the presidency, but the legislature, and that a grave you know, assault had been done to Bush by denying him what was a correct vote counting. And what would be revealed is that there would be, you know, during this, there were Republican paid thugs that showed up at polling places. Many within the Haitian immigrant community would have their ballots pre-punched for Bush. There were all of these revelations of very strange levels of fraud. And in many counties, including Miami-Dade, with large Democratic constituencies, there would be no, you know, those votes would be cast out. And the Supreme Court ruling, which was authored by Scalia, was extremely significant because, you know, essentially it meant that the population had no right to suffrage, that despite an election in which 100 million people voted, the presidency would be determined by, you know, 5 unelected justices. And we analyzed at the time that this was a ruling that would live in infamy, and it meant the complete breakdown of American democracy and constitutional norms. So, you know, I can also discuss some of the events that have transpired in the 20 years leading up to now.
Well, Joe, maybe you want to pick up on that, and because I think, you know, one element which is really important is why it is that the Socialist Equality Party and you two as candidates believe that it's the working class which is capable of transforming society. Why it isn't the case that the Socialist Equality Party and the International Committee rely on pressure campaigns against bourgeois parties like the groups that constitute the international pseudo-left do. So Joe, maybe based on what Nerissa said, I just want to make sure I frame it correctly. You know, how has the transformation in social consciousness over the last 20 years really strengthened the entire political basis of Marxist politics in the 21st century?
Well, we can address that question. I do just want to speak a little bit about the 2000 election too. And I think that one of I mean, since the Supreme Court voted 5-4 to hand the election to Bush, but actually what in the end led to that or to Bush taking power was the decision of Al Gore to concede the election and to not do anything to oppose this blatant theft, because it was very clear that Gore had won the popular vote. That was established, and that he had won in Florida if there was actually a recount. And then they intervened. There was all sorts of machinations I mean, it was a complete operation. But Gore said, and the Democratic Party said, we are not going to oppose this. And we said at the time, we said, the World Socialist website, we said that this demonstrated that there did not exist a significant constituency for democratic rights within the ruling class. That was what it showed, that they could steal an election and there would be no significant opposition within the ruling class to that. Gore also said during the course of the crisis, he said, I don't want to come to power in opposition to the military. And that was bound up with the question of whether military ballots would be counted. And his vice president, Lieberman, was on the most right wing of the Democratic Party. In any case, I think that was a central conclusion that we drew, that there was not a constituency for democratic rights within the ruling class. And the past 20 years have confirmed that, where you talk about immediately what happened, the war on terror, using the events of September 11th to justify a massive assault on democratic rights, the expansion of police spying, NSA spying, the Patriot Act, Guantanamo Bay, torture as policy of the United States, the whole series of dictatorial, essentially undemocratic measures implemented by the Bush administration, and then Obama drone assassination, including of U.S. citizens, the continuation of all of these policies. I would add to that the persecution of Julian Assange, who remains in prison, which has been spearheaded by the Democratic Party and is being subject to this absolute show trial, this travesty of justice, which is supported by the entire ruling class in the United States. That has been the trajectory of bourgeois politics. And what we said at the time has been confirmed. And now you have all of this sort of vomited up in the Trump administration, and the sort of rise of, sort of outright fascistic gangster into the White House. This is, what was said at the time about the crisis of American democracy has been now, sort of metastasized over the past 20 years, and now is erupting in this crisis 20 years later. The other side of it is the development of social opposition in the working class. You had the 2008 crisis, which had a big impact on the sort of radicalization of consciousness. We said at the time the change in objective conditions will lead American workers to change their mind, that there would be a growing interest in socialism as a result of the objective processes. And I think that's been confirmed. I think what is being referred to in that passage, though, it's critical, is that there's the objective process, which is the basis for socialism. And that objective process is very profound. Massive growth of social inequality, the pandemic itself, which has exposed so comprehensively the consequences of capitalist society and the policy of the ruling class. There's a profound radicalization. And to answer Oscar's question, you speak to workers, and there's enormous anger, among auto workers, Amazon workers, service workers over what is happening in the United States. And this is an international phenomenon. But that objective process has to be turned into a conscious movement for socialism. And then that raises the very complex question of social consciousness, of political consciousness. And, one has to recognize also the problems that exist. I mean, it is a fact that, whatever the poll, 40, 45, 50, we'll have to see, percent of the population that votes is going to vote for Trump. And that reflects something in the consciousness, the problems of the consciousness of sections, even of workers. And there's different factors behind this. There is the collapse of the trade unions. There's the right-wing character of the Democratic Party, the consequence of the promotion of the reactionary politics of race, all sorts of different factors, historical factors involved in this. But the objective process has to be turned into a conscious movement for socialism. And a critical instrument for that is the Revolutionary Party. It's the World Socialist website. It's the Socialist Equality Party. There's a growing readership of the World Socialist website. We have to develop this as the conscious the organ of international socialism. We have to educate the working class, explain to them what's going on. We have to bring an understanding of what is happening into the development of the class struggle. That's the critical task. Turn the objective movement into a conscious political movement to develop an understanding in the working class of the tasks it confront. And that requires of workers who have drawn conclusions that they have to fight for that, to fight to develop an understanding in the working class of what must be done. So I think that that is the great challenge that we confront. There's a profound objective basis for it, but it's something we really have to fight for. And there's no one outside of ourselves that's going to do it. No one outside of the World Socialist website and the Fourth International, which is fighting for this.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to make a few points too, based on what Joe's just said. I mean, a lot of the things that you've just cited, as far as what's happened in the last few decades, from the Patriot Act to massive NSA spying, essentially saying that the public has no right to privacy. As you mentioned, Assange and the revelations of the Iraq and Afghanistan war cables. Assange and Chelsea Manning would then be, attacked and pursued by U.S. imperialism. As you mentioned, Assange is now fighting for his life in Belmarsh prison, which is known as Britain's Guantanamo Bay. The attack of WikiLeaks and Assange and Manning, basically had laid out the basis and the argument that the people have no right to truth, that there is an attack on journalism, on freedom of the press, and also, as you'd mentioned, the killing of U.S. citizens under, Obama, notorious for drone assassinations. There was the killing of Anwar al-Awlaki, a U.S. citizen. What that means, when a government can kill, one of its citizens by drone assassination, is that that the right to due process, that the right to life, these fundamental constitutional rights are completely trampled on and are a dead letter. Also under the Obama administration, there would be the expansion of ICE, of immigrant detention centers. These would be, and massive deportations. So, under all of these, as well as actually, Obama called out the National Guard on protesters, in 2014 in Ferguson, when they protested the killing of Michael Brown, and this would continue with Eric Garner the year after Freddie Gray. And what that means too is that there's no right to freedom of speech, to protest. So I think what we're trying to draw out is that there has been a long and protracted attack on democratic rights. And, this has happened under, Republican and Democratic administrations, and was particularly, heightened under the Obama administration. So it's just, the biggest fallacy, the biggest, misconception that, workers can have is that the Democratic Party in any way could fight for or pursue any level of democratic rights or uphold the Constitution. That would be that would be to close your eyes to reality.
I think we still have a little bit of time left, so we'd encourage our viewers to submit any of your questions for Joe and Narissa. I think we'll put the page up on the screen. Visit that website and enter the code, or you can put the your questions on the social media page that you're watching this broadcast through. I think both of you have stressed that the SEP is fighting for the unity of the working class on the basis of a socialist program, that that's the only progressive solution to this crisis. One of the issues that looms very large is the promotion of racial, gender, identity politics by the Democratic Party, the media. We have a specific question here asking if you could both address the 1619 project, its promotion by the New York Times and the Democrats. I'm just wondering if you could speak about some of those issues and what's the position of the SEP on identity politics?
Well, I alluded to some of this, speaking about the character of the Democratic Party. One of the sort of essential sort of political roles of the Democratic Party, and certainly in the current political juncture, is to try to divert and to block the development of a independent movement of the working class of all races, of all genders, of all nationalities, to develop a class movement. And it's very conscious political strategy. The Democratic Party, those around it, promote the politics of racial division, the insistence that the fundamental social category in the United States is race, that it's a conflict between white America and Black America, that's the division that exists. And this is promoted in all sorts of books, and certainly in the New York Times and the 1619 Project, which I will return to, in relationship to the protests that have erupted over police violence, which have been mass demonstrations, which erupted first after the killing of George Floyd on May 25th, the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, that sparked massive demonstrations throughout the country involving workers and young people of all races. And the Democratic Party, the media sought to really to hijack that and to insist that, that as I said, the basic conflict is of a racial character. The protests, obviously there was enormous opposition to racism, particularly the racism that is promoted in the police, and that certainly exists. I mean, the police are drawn from the most backward and fascistic layers of society, but they were motivated by deeper concerns over social inequality, over the drive to authoritarianism, and police violence itself, while racism plays a role, is in fact directed at the working class. I mean, the principal reason you have such a disproportionate number of African Americans who are killed by police, they also are disproportionately represented in the poorest sections of the working class. And in fact, the majority of those who are killed by police are still white, or the plurality. So it's an issue which faces workers of all races. It's bound up with the class character of the state as an instrument of class rule. But these basic class questions were covered over, were obscured, and the Democratic Party sought to divert it into a question of racial conflict. And this takes more reactionary forms, including proposals for racial segregation in college dormitories and this sort of thing. And it's incredibly reactionary because it is aimed at blocking the development of a united movement of the working class, so promoting racial conflict. The 1619 Project, and this is a complicated question, which I can't go into in great detail, all of the material that we have written on this on the World Socialist website. We have just published an important essay on the WSWS, which I would encourage everyone to read, which is on the fact that the 1619 Project has essentially collapsed. They had to retract their basic argument that was at the center of the whole project, which was that the true founding of the United States was 1619 and not 1776. And the aim of the project was to insist that the United States was founded on the basis of white supremacy, and that racial conflict has dominated the entire history of America, that all of American history and the present American politics is bound up with the conflict of races, that racism is in the DNA of the United States, which was the argument of the project and its founder, Nicole Hannah-Jones. And this required a falsification of history, and we've written about this extensively on the World Socialist website. I would encourage everyone to read the material that we have produced. But it was very political. The whole project, it was bound up with this politics, the politics of racial division. So we oppose that. The Socialist Equality Party, we oppose that. We of course acknowledge the existence of racism. It exists, and it has to be fought against. We fight against all forms of of oppression and inequality. But the basis for fighting that is the development of a united movement of the working class. We reject absolutely the claim that white workers are irretrievably racist, that the problem is the racism of the white working class. That is false, and it's reactionary. And it cuts across, is aimed at cutting across the development of a united movement of the working class. The pandemic affects workers of all races, of all nationalities. Global warming, inequality, the danger of war, dictatorship. These are issues which confront the entire working class, and they have to be met with a movement of the working class.
Thank you, Joe. It's hard to just sort of pass so many of those themes that you've raised, to pass on from them, but just because of time, we have to move on to take a couple of more questions. The World Socialist website has published just a tremendous amount of material opposing the 1619 campaign's falsifications, and it really is, it's a monument to the fight to unify the working class of all races and nationalities. I agree. We have a question now for Norisa from Gabriel Moisen of Mexico's El Universal newspaper, who asks, what are your proposals for the U.S. relationship with Mexico in immigration, trade, regional politics, and other key issues? Norisa, would you like to respond?
Yes, thank you very much, Gabriel, for your question. I'll start by saying that the position of the Socialist Equality Party and of socialism is that the working class throughout the world shares the same fundamental interests and requires unification. So just to lay out some of our initial programmatic demands is that we would call for, one, the immediate closure of all detention centers with the fundamental belief, that there should be full citizenship rights to all immigrants. And as far as the relationship with Mexico that the US has, what is that relationship? The relationship is that Mexico is the cheap labor platform of North America. The government of AMLO, as Joe mentioned earlier, presents itself as being, a friend of the working class, but couldn't be anything further from that.
Just on that, but he said he was a friend of Trump's. He said Trump was his great friend.
Yeah, no, but AMLO and Morena, has come to power, falsely claiming themselves to be, friends of the working class. But in reality, what are conditions in Mexico? Some 50% of the population is reliant upon the gig economy. And that has meant, particularly under the pandemic, that the majority of people have no means by which of staying home and protecting themselves, no access to any kind of unemployment or social services, and what has been AMLO's position with regards to immigration, really upholding the line and the policies of the Trump administration. AMLO is supposed, and the Mexican military and immigration are to act as sort of a layer of defense to prevent desperate immigrants who are, fleeing and seeking asylum in the U.S. from, crossing the U.S. Mexico border. Additionally, throughout the pandemic, as I said, the majority of the population has been unable to, stay home, and some of the largest workforces are in border towns, in towns like Tijuana and Matamoros, in Juarez, where there's thousands of factories, maquiladoras, and they have remained open through the pandemic, not just because AMLO wanted them to, but because of international pressure from finance capital. So the Mexican working class is not only, exploited by the Mexican bourgeoisie, they are exploited by an international working class. So workers in the US and throughout the world and throughout North America have every interest in the fight for socialism, that the policies, that the way that society is run is in the interests of the masses and not in the interests of the elite financial oligarchy and the capitalist class. So, we call for the United Socialist States of North America and throughout the Americas. This comes fundamentally from the unification of the working class and our orientation towards internationalism. So and it isn't just in Mexico, but there are many other low wage factory cities throughout the world that are there to be the producers for the world's ruling elite. And particularly Mexico has been promoted as part of the anti-China campaign, that rather than offshore production, they call it nearshore production. And historically too, the Mexican working class has been pitted against the American working class as if they're their enemy. And we fundamentally reject that, and we call on the unification of workers in Mexico and the US and throughout the world.
Thank you, Narissa. I just wanted to raise an issue that we've touched on previously, and that is the fact that this election is unfolding amid a real ratcheting up of tensions between the US and some of its global rivals, particularly China. Every day, virtually, there are provocative remarks by representatives of the Trump administration, military actions in the South China Sea, etc. And the response of the Democrats is to try to really seek to outdo Trump in terms of the anti-China rhetoric. So several of our viewers have asked if you could comment on these developments, and particularly the threat of war amid this election crisis.
Well, I think it's a very real threat. There's a tradition which goes by the name of the October surprise of bourgeois politicians in the United States launching one or another provocation in the midst of an election. I think more profoundly, and I think that's a real danger. And whether we're talking about China, where Trump has been escalating, as you say, the anti-China rhetoric, also connected to the efforts to blame China for the coronavirus pandemic, or whether it's Russia, which has been the particular focus of the Democratic Party, or some sort of provocation against Iran or Venezuela. There was just the outbreak now of conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan, which threatens to develop into a broader conflict, the conflict between Turkey and Greece in the Mediterranean. There's innumerable flashpoints in the world geopolitical situation that can be or India and Pakistan, that can be the spark for a broader conflict. And I think there certainly is a danger. I think there's both sort of political calculations, but whether it's Trump or the Democrats, but perhaps more profoundly, I mean, you know, there's always the danger that the ruling elites, when confronting immense social crisis and political crisis, that they seek to utilize war as a method for diverting tensions outward, and also creating the conditions for political repression. It should be noted that, you know, amidst this sort of whole political crisis, one of the themes of the Democratic Party, which they're pursuing relentlessly, is that social divisions and conflicts in the United States are stoked by Russia. That you know, if it wasn't for Vladimir Putin, you know, the United States would be a tranquil, peaceful place with no real significant conflict, which of course is absurd. But it creates the framework for the criminalization of political dissent, for internet censorship. You know, it certainly has been the framework within which they have carried out their persecution of Julian Assange. I think that there is, just go back to the question, there is a real danger of war, of provocations, of the utilization of war and the attempt to address or create the conditions for addressing social tensions, as I said, creating the framework for political repression. And workers have to fight against that. The United States has spearheaded, and that's the task of the international working class, in particular, you know, the development of a movement in the United States, connecting the interests of the working class with the fight against war. The United States has been at war for more than a quarter century, unending war. The war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq, Yemen and Libya, and the civil war in Syria, and countless countries where the United States has staged provocations, attempted to manipulate internal politics. That is now developing into a conflict between what they call the great powers. The danger of a world war is something which is being discussed. The use of nuclear weapons is something which is being actively war gamed within the military strategists. This is a extreme danger that the International Committee has focused the attention of workers and young people on, and there has to be a movement against it. But that, you know, the fight against imperialism, as the ICFI stated in a statement published in 2016, the fight against imperialism has to be connected to. It's impossible without the fight for socialism, and the fight for socialism is impossible without a fight against imperialism.
Thank you, Joe and Nerissa. It's a difficult task to try and summarize some of the questions which are coming in, which are very interesting, but a number of them address themes related to questions of history. And both of you already have addressed questions relating to more recent history, like the 2000 election, as well as questions related to the American Revolution, to the progressive character of the Civil War, etc. There's also questions coming in about what type of historical periods would you compare this to? But I actually maybe want to ask a somewhat, to pivot off of those questions. Why is it that in the perspective of the Socialist Equality Party and the International Committee of the Fourth International, questions of history and historical perspective emerge as so central to the development of our political line on a day-to-day basis. I think that the Socialist Equality Party in Germany has done some tremendously important work, which if you are not aware of, you should go and read. It's all available in English on the efforts by the German bourgeoisie to revitalize even the image of Hitler himself and to relativize the crimes carried out by the Nazi regime. The World Socialist website also just posted a 6-part series on the last year of Leon Trotsky's life to commemorate the 80th anniversary of Trotsky's assassination at the hands of the Stalinist secret police in August of 1940. So I just wonder, maybe, and either of you can take this, but why is, to circle back after this long question, why is it that these historical issues are so central to what you're saying in this election campaign?
Nerissa, would you like to speak?
I can start.
Sure.
Historical questions are of immense importance, not just for our campaign and our party, but of the entire history of Marxism and the Marxist method. Marx and Engels and the earliest Marxists studied the lessons of the French and the American Revolution, the lessons of the 1848 and 49 revolutions that really pointed to the fact that the working class and the proletariat had to have an independent political perspective, that it would be undermined by hostile class forces. In 1850, Engels would write about the peasant revolt in Germany to explain many of these themes. Similarly, the great revolutionists that would emerge in the latter part of the 19th century, from Plekhanov to Trotsky and Lenin, would also, study all of the great historical events. These are events that are not just applicable or important to one section of the world or one section of the working class, or the oppressed masses, but these are important lessons for the development of a highly conscious international working class. So, what we're saying is that workers and young people have to study the events of what has transpired before them. Really important to that education is looking to the World Socialist website and marrying books to learn about particularly many of the important events and experiences in the 20th century, including that of the Russian Revolution and the experience of the Soviet Union and Stalinism. So these are questions that continue to present themselves today, and it isn't for no reason that we're discussing the 1619 project, that we're discussing the history of the American Revolution, of the Declaration of Independence. Many of these questions and lessons are pertinent and important and completely vital for workers to study.
Yeah, I would. I very much agree with those points. I would just add that, political social consciousness, I think, is inherently historical consciousness. Upon what basis will the working class develop a political perspective under these conditions of immense crisis? It has to be upon the basis of a working through and a assimilation of the experiences of the past. I mean, if one wants to know, and then bringing them into the present situation. I mean, if one wants to understand fascism and how to fight it, one has to study the lessons of the past. There are many lessons which arise out of Hitler's conquest of power, or really the handing of power to Hitler by the German ruling class in the 1930s. But one of the central ones was the consequence of the political subordination of the opposition of the working class to the parties of the ruling elite, to the parties of capitalism. And those who made the argument, well, in order to stop Hitler, one has to support other factions of the bourgeois establishment. But then actually turned around and gave Hitler power. And it proved bankrupt and catastrophic. And the catastrophic policies of the Comintern as well. I mean, I can't go into in detail some of these experiences, but the point I want to make is that the orientation of workers and youth in the present has to be based upon an understanding of what happened in the past. And on that basis, one is able to chart a course for the future. What happened in the 20th century? Of course, what are the issues which arise immediately when one talks about the necessity of the fight for socialism? Well, what was Stalinism? What was the Soviet Union? And then that is bound up intimately, and it's bound up with the history of the Trotskyist movement, the history of the Fourth International. You can't really address the challenges of the development of socialist consciousness without an understanding of these historical experiences. And whenever we're talking about anything, I mean, the experiences of Sanders. Well, one of the problems with the ability of young people to get fooled by Sanders, not just once, but twice, actually. He performed this operation in 2016 and then in 2020, is that they haven't been educated in the experiences of the working class with such movements, the experiences of the efforts to transform the Democratic Party, the graveyard of social movements. I mean, these, none of these issues are in a sense new. But so again, just to stress the point, the development of a socialist movement has to incorporate it into it these historical experiences, and that history is encapsulated in its most conscious form in the history of the socialist movement itself, because that's the history of the working through of the experiences of the working class in its conscious form. And the history of the socialist movement is the history of the Fourth International. So we have, in fact, in all of our work, in the work of the International Committee, of the World Socialist website, we're constantly striving to bring forward this history and to oppose the falsifications of history, which are always been bound up with political considerations, to defend historical truth in order to, as a necessary component of the development of socialist consciousness. I guess we're probably reaching towards the end of the meeting. Is that right, Eric? Do we have time for any more questions?
Well, let me ask you another follow-up one, which just comes to mind as you're speaking, if that's all right.
Sure.
Well, it's a very basic question, which is, this is a planet with 7 billion plus people on it, hundreds and hundreds of political parties, probably thousands and thousands of them. Where do you locate the International Committee of the Fourth International and the Socialist Equality Party in the whole political trajectory of this complex world political situation?
Well, the International Committee is the organized expression of the fight for socialism. We are the socialists. We are the Marxists. The Trotskyist movement is the continuity of Marxism. There is no other political tendency which is fighting for this perspective, which is fighting for a perspective of revolutionary socialism. I mean, the performance of tendencies like the DSA faction of the Democratic Party, Jacobin magazine, which is just transformed into a sort of auxiliary arm of the Biden campaign. I mean, this is repeated, internationally. I mean, you have sort of the movement of what we call the pseudo left to the right, their integration into bourgeois politics. Our movement fights for the development of fights for revolutionary socialism, for the building of a socialist movement in the working class. We're oriented towards the working class. Our movement expresses the interests of the working class in the United States and around the world. We fight for the international unity of the working class, and there is no other political movement outside of the Fourth International, the International Committee of the Fourth International, that is fighting for that. I would just, conclude with, by urging all of those listening today to join our party. We want you to vote for us come election day. If you're in Colorado, as I said, we'll be on the ballot. Anywhere else, write in our names and vote for the Socialist Equality Party in this election. But the more central conclusion, that really has to be drawn is that a real socialist movement has to be built. That is, the Trump administration, the drive toward dictatorship, the very real enormous dangers which confront workers and young people all over the world. The coronavirus pandemic, which has killed over 1 million people already internationally, and over 200,000 people in the United States. The massive social catastrophe, the danger of world war, environmental degradation, police violence. That none of these questions can be resolved outside of the fight for socialism, for the building of a revolutionary movement in the working class. I mean, that is the conclusion that workers and youth have to draw. They have to draw the conclusion from the experiences of the Democratic Party, the fecklessness of the Biden, of their response to the Trump's coup attempts, the consequences of Sanders' election campaign. I mean, real conclusions have to be drawn from this, and that means now is the time to take up the fight for socialism. The future of mankind will be determined by, say, two trajectories. There's the trajectory of the ruling class towards authoritarianism and war, and there's a trajectory of the working class towards revolution. And how the future of mankind will be determined by which of those fundamental processes prevails. But the answer to that question is not something which is simply determined by the objective movement of events. It's also determined by the decisions of individuals to take up a fight, to say, all right, well, this is a situation, this has to be fought for, and I'm going to make that decision. And I would just, the fight has begun. The Socialist Equality Party is organizing the development of independent organizations of working class struggle, is fighting to build a socialist consciousness in the working class. And we really want everyone participating in this, listening to this and watching this broadcast to make that decision, to join our party and to join our sister parties in the International Committee of the Fourth International and take up this fight as your own fight.
Thank you, Joe. I'd like to just make a couple of additional points. First of all, I would like to second those comments by Joe. Vote for Joe and Nerissa in the elections coming up, but also recognize the really serious and dangerous character of this crisis and its international implications. Things are being there are plans for the imposition of forms of extremely reactionary rule in the United States, which will provoke massive social opposition. The outcome of what happens is not determined yet. It's not written in the stars. It will be determined by whether you, those who are watching at home, decide to enter the fight and decide to join the socialist movement. And the more of you that do, the healthier you are, the more you develop yourself theoretically and historically, the stronger the working class is going to be in the immense battles on the immediate class battles on the immediate horizon. Just a couple of final points. First of all, I would like to thank Joe and Nerissa for attending. I would also like to thank Oscar for attending from Australia. It is very important that those who are watching this meeting understand we are not an American party. We are an international party, and it is always profoundly informative and helpful to have our international comrades attend these meetings. Thank you for being here, Oscar. I do have to now make a fund appeal because we're in a situation where the fight for socialism requires resources. And so we are asking that if you're on this call, go to socialism2020.org/donate. You can do it now. You can enter in your information and make a contribution. We need it. It's absolutely necessary. This fight that we're discussing will require an immense amount of resources. Trump, and I just have some figures here about what has been raised so far in the American elections. Obviously, we don't have the networks of bundlers and financiers that are required to raise the big bucks. Biden has raised $540 million. That's probably gone up since the time I wrote that down. Trump has raised $487 million. Both of those, by the way, which break any fundraising record set before by any candidate in American history. And there's still several weeks to go. So we rely on you. Contribute. Give us what you can. Go to the website, which you see on your screen. You do have to be a U.S. citizen or a legal permanent resident to contribute, but we hope that you will. Read the World Socialist website. Continue to follow our campaign. We're glad that you joined us, and we will be announcing further events like this in the near future. So thank you again, everybody, for attending. Good night.
Good night.